Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Warhammer lore video. Haven't done any nightly orders in a while, so I figured I would rectify that with a video on the Knights of the White Wolf and the Knights of Morr. So, starting out with the doggies, the Knights of the White Wolf is one of the most famous of the Templar orders that have dedicated themselves to the god Ulrich and the service of his embodiment on Earth, the Ulrich of the cult of Ulrich. This high priest essentially constitutes their highest level of command and is usually the one to dispatch them out on missions. They are often requested to go out and do stuff by various elector counts as well, and they usually respond to these requests as long as, well, the Ulrich gives the go-ahead, but they are only technically obliged to follow the orders of the elector count of Middenheim, who has some pull over them, although even then the Ulrich can gainsay him and stop the Templars from actually deploying, but usually the relationship between the Ulrich and the elector count of Middenheim is pretty damn good, as Middenheim is also the center of the cult of Ulrich. The Knights of the White Wolves is also the oldest Templar order in the Old World, having been founded during the Age of Sigmar. No, not that one, the actual Age of Sigmar, some 2,500 years ago. And it is partially due to this ancient history, and of course their worship of Ulrich, whose embodiment is a wolf, that they adopt this rather savage visage. The Knights of the White Wolves keep their hair unkept and cultivate large and fearsome-looking beards, as well as adopting a rather savage battlefield stance. Now, this is all somewhat superficial, as in reality the Knights of the White Wolf are an extremely disciplined and organized fighting force. You could even argue that their savage exterior has more to do with tactical concerns rather than just being barbarians. They recognize the fact that looking large, strong, ugly, and scary is a rather potent tool on the battlefield. This is also further enhanced by their massive two-handed cavalry hammers that are not only remarkably savage weapons, but are also rather effective. And this could be seen as a wonderful metaphor of the White Wolves themselves. They're savage-looking, perhaps even a little bit brutal and blunt, but they are incredibly deadly and very, very effective at their given task. In battle, they act as extremely heavy, brawling cavalry. They lack the sheer shock of many other knightly orders with their long, powerful lances and their powerful chargers trained specifically for the fury of the charge, but they more than make up for this with their abilities to really hack it out in melee combat beyond the abilities of most heavy cavalry. Their exquisitely designed armor is, of course, a rather considerable advantage in the hack and slash of melee. Additionally, their big, strong, powerfully built warhorses are more than capable of taking a fair bit of damage, and the long warhammers that are wielded with extreme skill by the White Wolves themselves are more than capable of keeping everyone but the most determined of enemies at an arm's length. This focus on brawling melee combat rather than shock might originally seem a bit strange for a dedicated cavalry force. This hails back to their founding history, where they were originally intended not as an offensive cavalry force, but rather as a defensive force of temple guardians. You see, originally, the Knights of the White Wolf were intended to guard the various temples of the cult of Ulrich. Now, the White Wolves themselves as an offensive force were kept under the leader of the cult, the Ulrich, who was obliged to keep a force of fighting men always ready and under his command to answer any plight put forth by the faithful of Ulrich, and also to protect his various holy places. Additionally, the holy men of the cults and those who established temples were all expected to defend said temples. Now, the priest of Ulrich himself was usually an accomplished fighter, but in all due likelihood there were also a small militia of faithful, as well as at least 1 or 2 Knights of the White Wolf, partially as symbolic guardians of the faith, and partially as large burly bearded men with very heavy hammers. But to begin with, this was a somewhat limiting role, simply because, well, having a body of fighting men always at the ready is not a cheap endeavour by any stretch of the imagination. It was only later on, when they gained the patronage of various elect accounts and the cult of Ulrich grew larger and wealthier, that they became able to found more specialised chapter houses of Night Wolf, the primary one being the one in Middenheim. These groups of White Wolves were not dedicated guardians like their ancestors. Rather, they were used as the military arm of the cult of Ulrich, where they would march to war alongside the armies of the Elector Counts of Middenheim. They could be sent off on various quests, whether they be of a religious nature, economic nature, or whatever else the church required. Essentially, they became almost a group of enforcers for the cult of Ulrich, and additionally, of course, they are a Templar order. As such, they have on multiple occasions participated in holy crusades with various other knightly orders against various enemies, and those they considered to be, well, heretical. However, even though the Order of the White Wolf has developed more and more into a professional military order rather than their original guard duties, they do still maintain quite a few of their old traditions. For example, all temples of Ulrich are still guarded by a pair of white wolves. Additionally, they refuse the wearing of helmets on the battlefield, preferring instead to show off their beautifully braided beards and their long, flowing, oh-so-glamorous hair, as well as refusing to use shields, because, well, shields are for pussies, obviously, and they need both arms to wield that giant-ass hammers of theirs. They usually also festooned their steeds with various wolf talismans, tails, pieces of pelts, teeth, etc., as well, of course, as their famous wolf cloaks. Every single brother of the White Wolf has in his possession such a cloak, and it is virtually always worn when he is on official duty. However, unlike the old days, the current Knights of the White Wolves are not required to go out and kill their own wolf. In some cases, the pelt appears to be hereditary, and in other cases, the pelt might even be purchased, although this is a mark of considerable shame and is usually only used as a stopgap until the knight can acquire a bit more of a prestigious pelt. As such, the tradition of actually going out and getting himself a proper wolf pelt is usually maintained, unless in the case of a particularly prestigious pelt. For example, the pelt of the Grand Master is often reused for new Grand Masters. In some occasions, various temples with particularly long and prestigious histories also have, communal pelts that is then passed from guardian to guardian. Although, of course, the wear and tear of everyday use, not to mention battle, does put some rather severe limitations on just how ancient these pelts can really be, and some evil tongues might even suggest that some of these apparently hundreds of years old pelts might not be the original beast's fur. They also maintained their ancestors' tradition of riding into battle while screaming like men having their testicles ripped out through their nostrils. This rather horrifying sound, as you might imagine, has sent several enemies scattering before a single hammer blow has been struck. But enough about the screaming savages. Let's move on to a more elegant order of, racists. Or in this case, actually ableists. The Knights of Morr. Their sole purpose for being is being mean to the undead, which is, of course, very non-PC, but the way in which they do it is just so downright awesome that you really just have to forgive them and revel in their glorious silence. You see, The Knights of Morr have realized that looking fan-fucking-tastic and being cool as all hell is a very effective battlefield weapon. As such, they paint their armor in a deep purple, almost black color, and ride into battle with complete and utter silence surrounding them. Some members of their orders even going so far as to having enchantments put upon their steeds and equipment to further silence them. You can imagine just how eerie this would be, seeing a group of extremely heavily armored and heavily armed individual in nightmarish black plate riding down upon you in complete and utter silence. Oh yes, creepy deepy indeed, my friends. But Arch, you might now say, aren't they primarily a order fighting against the undead? Would the undead really give that much of a shit about the fact that they're silent? Surely the undead cannot feel fear, now can they, being undead and all, or, disabled? But, you see, the thing is, the Knights of Morr are not only here to protect the living from the dead, they're also here to protect the dead from the living, as somewhat absurd as that may sound, but it does have a rather logical reason behind it. You see, in the Warhammer universe, there are of course quite a few people with knowledge of necromancy and the dark arts that would really love to sneak his creepy little ass into a graveyard and create himself a little undead horde to do his every bidding, and these biddings are usually less than healthy for the local communities around. This is one of the reasons why most Empire graveyards are constructed essentially as labyrinths to confuse both someone trying to get into the graveyard and to confuse the restless dead should they try and get out of the graveyard. After all, corpses are not known for their abilities in logical problem solving, and as such, a nice solid labyrinth is usually more than enough to keep the little bastards inside until either the spell that is animating them subsides and they simply return to being dead, or until sufficient forces can be mobilized from nearby garrisons to return them to their natural state of being not walking and eating the fucking living. And, of course, graveyards are not very safe places in the Warhammer universe, so having a bunch of really creepy, scary-looking guardians makes it a hell of a lot easier to encourage people to keep the fuck out of the graveyards. In fact, it has even come to the point where mothers use the examples of the Knights of Morr to scare their children, saying that, oh, if you don't eat your food, or if you don't fuck off to bed right now, you little brat, mummy's going to get the ladle and beat the shit out of you, or, wait, no, that got dark all of a sudden. If you don't go to bed right now, then the Knights of Morr are going to come and fetch you and pull your nose out through your anus. And this, as you might imagine, is rather effective, both for teaching children not to go into the zombie-infested graveyards, and also for teaching the children for when they grow up, again, to stay the fuck away from the zombie-infested graveyard. Imagining you can see a pattern forming here. Additionally, of course, they are also the guardians of the graveyards in a more economical sense, because they are of course Templars of the God of Death, of Morr, and Morr's primary domain are of course graveyards. As such, they are protecting the realm of their gods. Additionally, the temples of Morr draw a considerable amount of their financial power, which they do have a fair bit of, surprisingly enough, from various donations given to their temples to help speed the passage of beloved family members who have passed on, etc. And, of course, the Empire is one of those nations that have a habit of burying their dead ones along with a rather embarrassing amount of valuables, which, again, is a fairly good reason for people who are down on their lucks to have a little wander into the graveyard and see if they can't find something shiny to bring outside with them. After all of those rumours of zombies and necromancers and walking skeletons, not to mention the Knights of Morr, all of this is sure to be just nonsense, right? Walking skeletons? Absurd. Just about as ridiculous as the whole idea of giant rats living in the sewers. But, of course, the Knights of Morr are not only glorified guardsmen, they also fulfill a rather important battlefield duty, as they are the only knightly order within the Empire that specializes in fighting the undead. To help them do exactly this, they are the only knightly order that uses ranged weaponry. Because, of course, quite a few of the proper big and nasty undeads are remarkably powerful creatures. We're not just talking stuff like zombies or walking skeletons here, we're talking vampires, vargulf, or zombie dragons. Shit that you probably don't want to be getting into an arm wrestling contest with. And additionally, of course, beyond the very solid maxim of know thy foe, the Knights of Morr are also quite accustomed to the antics of the undead, which means they are considerably harder to frighten than your average Empire straight troop, and often the primary power of an undead horde is to scare the living bejesus out of anyone unfortunate enough to be sent to fight them. The Knights of Morr, of course, have no such handicap. Additionally, they have trained for a rather considerable period of time, both in the specific tactics required to take down the undead, but also in limited spellcrafting and the arts of Morr himself. You could kind of call them warrior priests, although not quite to the extent of the actual warrior priests. They have knowledge of basic rituals to calm the undead, for example, to stop them rising from the grave without actually having to fight them. They also have a fair few rituals at their disposal, which are essentially turn undead spells that allows them to inflict considerable damage on the lower forms of undead, although these rituals are usually relatively weak and will only work on uncontrolled undead. Undead that have been caused to rise from their graves via natural events. Well, Warhammer World natural events, rather than purposefully reanimated and then controlled by a necromancer or a vampire. But the Blackguard of Morr are of course not entirely reliant on spells and cantrips. They are considerably skilled fighters, especially against their preferred foe, and usually use weapons specifically designed to counter just this type of nonsense. They have a wide arsenal of various weapons made from, for example, silver or obsidian, which are particularly effective against the undead. In most cases where they are required to guard graveyards or guard particular objectives, as they are primarily a defensive order, they usually have stockpiles of weapons from which they can draw the weapons that are most useful against the particular foe that they're going to be fighting. For example, if they're going to be fighting hordes of skeletons, they will use massive two-handed silver hammers, better to smash bones. If they're going to be fighting a vampire, for example, they would probably prefer something a little bit more devastating, with the ability perhaps to defend themselves with perhaps long wicked halberds, allowing them to keep the enemy at a little bit of a distance, as well as allowing them to deliver devastating blows and using the shaft as a means of defense. If they're going to be fighting hordes of slow but incredibly numerous, and potentially lethal if they get a hold of you zombies, they might prefer a heavy shield, along with pikes or other, again, halberds or heavy axes, better to keep their opponents at a distance until they can land a solid blow to the head to finish off the zombie, or otherwise dismember them to such an extent that they are no longer capable of inflicting damage. Additionally, they often use, as a standard part of their equipment, massive longbows from which they fire specialized ammunition, silver-tipped ammunition, or otherwise holy ammunition that has been anointed in holy water. There is even mentions of special arrowheads that are hollow, in which there is a small glass vial containing holy water. These weapons work by the weapon being fired, normally from the longbow, and then using the blunt force of the arrow hitting the opponent to shatter the small glass vial, thereby injecting the holy liquid into the target, which can be quite effective indeed. And of course they keep extensive armories of more mundane weapons to deal with simpler opponents, grave robbers or thieves, this kind of stuff. Although, again, the simple appearance of a Knight of Morr is usually more than enough to make any wannabe grave robber seriously reconsider his chosen profession. And that has been another Knightly Orders lore video on the White Wolves and the Knights of Morr. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you soon for more lore videos. Have a good day.